Welcome to MexMoves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance. How are you, Eduardo?
Doing well, Damien, as far as one can be.
Yeah, well, it's been a challenging week if you live in Mexico City with the CENTE student teacher union blocking many of the main arteries. Today was really bad from a traffic perspective.
Yeah.
So today what we're going to talk about is we have a great interview with Miriam Acuña, who's the head economist at GBM Casa de Bolsa here in Mexico City. She's going to talk a bit about the economy in Mexico and how she's seeing it for the rest of the year and how it's going to deal with Trump's tariffs and with the slowdown in the U.S. economy. And we also have an interview with Andrés Benavides. He's the founder and the CEO of an Edtech company called Cometa that provides administrative and financial software to private schools in Mexico for the most part. And Eduardo, what's on your mind this week?
Well, I don't know if you saw that El Puerto de Liverpool, one of the biggest department stores sales companies in Mexico, is going full steam ahead with a joint venture with the Nordstrom family up north in the United States. They're both agreed to invest and take the company private. Liverpool is going to be the indirect owner of 49.9% in that department stores company in America, while the Nordstrom family will hold the rest, a 50.1%. So it's been a rapid story of partnership. The two companies began last year to joint efforts, and now they're going to be really married, if I may say so, in an almost equal partnership with a company up in the United States. Retail in the United States is a very challenging business because of the rapid inroads that e-commerce has made. Mexico is not far behind, but way less challenged yet. But it's going to be interesting to see what Liverpool in this almost equal ownership brings to the plate and tries to revamp or restart the business proposal of Nordstrom in the United States. It's, again, one Mexican company venturing north with a very large acquisition, not full control, but a very important stake in a very important company in America, or a company that was very important a few years back in America that has lost some of its power, but it's, I guess, seeking help from a Mexican company and try to revamp its operations and go back to where it was, or at least still detain the losing share of market that they've suffered in the past. Just another story of the integration between the two economies, not just trade-wise, but ownership-wise.
And Eduardo, do you think they're doing this to diversify away from Mexico, reduce Mexico risk, or do you think they think they have some sort of value added that they've acquired in Mexico that can be usefully applied in the U.S.?
It's hard to know. I think Mexico's risks has increased over the past few years because of the changes the new governments have brought to the economic model that we've had. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that the U.S. risk that Nordstrom has with the e-commerce challenging it is lower than Mexico. It's hard to see what the proposition is from a Liverpool point of view. I guess both, if you ask me, diversing from one single country strategy to a bi-national country strategy in similar circumstances. So maybe Liverpool has a better cost efficiency operational that it could teach Nordstrom, although they've never operated in such a large market as the U.S. It's hard to know. I think the story will develop as it moves forward. But right now, I don't know how the risk element works for the Liverpool brand.
So a few stories caught my attention. In fact, all of them appeared in white papers, indispensable daily Substack. Grupo Econ announced it was acquiring Shell's gas station operations in Mexico, as you probably saw. Econ is the Mexican conglomerate that manages 7-Eleven and Petro 7. And they the deal apparently encompasses about 150 gas stations. And I imagine that, when Shell first came into Mexico, they were attracted by the then opening of the gas station market, the energy market in general. And obviously since then, we've seen a counter energy reform, and the energy sector has remained closed, or even more closed than it was in some areas. And these big international oil companies like Shell make their money mostly from trading and storing gasoline, not that interested per se in the margin at the retail level. And with importing much more complex and storage very limited, I think they probably thought that the margins at the gas station level weren't sufficient. And Grupo Econ, obviously running 7-Eleven, was sort of better positioned to take advantage of the gas stations that they have and extract more value from them. And probably as a local company, probably can be more cost efficient as well. So there's sort of the hopes that were created by the energy opening, turned out not to transpire as positively as people thought, and hence we've seen this transaction. Would be my take. Any different view?
Yeah, I think if we talked about risks, Damian, in this case, I think Shell might have seen the risks rise in the Mexican market and decided to let it go. I think it's a bad sign, the transaction, because I think there were great hopes for us consumers to have a greater number of players in the retail gasoline industry. But we've seen not just hold off of giving more permits, but also we've seen the government intervening in the price. A few months ago, they set a maximum price for the Magnum, or the low sulfur gasoline in Mexico, at 24 pesos a liter. And that always goes against the efficiencies of market players. And I don't think the signals have been in the right place by the Sheinbaum administration, let alone by the López Obrador administration. So my view is that this transaction, although it's still in private hands, the gas stations that Shell is deciding to sell, it's a sign that the hopes that the energy reform had of a greater number of players, be it in the retail sector, in the storage, transportation, distribution of different types of fuels, it's not materializing. Even in the oil extraction sector, we've already seen a few of the initial players let the country go. So I think it's just a risk decision that Shell is taking and letting go of its retail gas stations in Mexico.
Another story in white paper that caught my attention was Tala, which I have to say is a company I wasn't familiar with. It's a Californian-based FinTech specializing in microloans, has greatly expanded its operations in Mexico. It's already, since entering the market in 2018, when AMLO became president, it's given out over 15 million loans to 3 million customers for 1.5 billion of total loan value, and it just got a new debt facility to continue to grow in Mexico. I thought what was quite interesting about this is, well, one, that an American sort of firm that's very relatively unknown at the corporate level in Mexico, is taking on what are quite high risk, what's appear to be high risk personal loans. I was looking it up on their website. The loans are from 500 pesos to 10,000. It's all paperless, no guarantees. You don't even need a proof of your income, and it says they don't even necessarily need to check you with the credit bureau. Obviously, interest rates are high, minimum of 200% per year, and a maximum, according to the website, of 440%. But there are actually quite a few American companies in the kind of low-income credit area in Mexico. You have First Cash, which is quoted in the US, but they have 1,700 pawn shops in Mexico. So they're the largest pawn shop operator. So clearly they're issuing asset-backed small microloans against the merchandise, and they've been on a buying spree in Mexico and have grown, to be the largest. And also EasyCore, which is also listed in the US, they have over 500 pawn stores in Mexico under different brands like Empeño Fácil, and they recently bought 50 stores from Presto Dinero, which is auto pawn services, and I think that deal might have fallen through. So there's a there is a sort of trend of the US companies using their lower cost of capital in the US and maybe some of their technological know-how to grow in Mexico, and that's been quite successful. And then in the Beaver stock market, you have a Mexican player, Globcash, which has the brand Casa Mazatlan, and they have been competing very effectively against East Corp and First Cash. So there's sort of under the radar quite a large U.S. presence in microcredits in Mexico. And talking about microcredits, you might have noticed that the stock market reached an all-time high in Mexico, and the best performing stock in Mexico was Gentera or Compartamos, which is a low-income credit provider in Mexico. And actually, the stock market 21%, and you saw Gentera up 60%. A lot of the banks have done exceptionally well in this environment. So Banorte was up 40%, and the stock market was up. The stock bolster was up 38%. So you've seen quite a lot of very strong performance despite Trump, or maybe because of Trump, in the financial sector in Mexico.
No, there is, that you talk about Tal and this micro lending. There's been some news in that sector in Mexico. Nacional Monte de Piedad has been in the news lately as one of these casas de empeño pawn shops because of its union and the demands that the union were bringing up upon them. And I think the competition in that sector has increased over the years with these American companies coming in, the banks like Gentera and others getting to know that sector very well, giving very small amounts of loans at high interest rates and taking large returns. But Banco Azteca is not in that business. It is in a certain way with the retail little payments that the buyers of Electra do with a loan from Azteca and so on and so forth. So it's quite a competitive industry, I suspect, and those that are not ready will suffer. And the fact that these Tala companies looking into Mexico with its low capital costs, it's another indication that they see a market. There is appetite with the number of remesas coming in, growing and growing. I don't know if the tax will hurt that or not, but people have money and they could pawn certain things or get a loan and set up a business. It's something that's been growing. Probably it could grow at a faster rate, if you ask me, because of Mexico's underutilized banking system. But it's an indication that things are moving in that sector without a doubt.
And I'd like to set the stage for an interview with Andrés Benavides, the founder of Cometa. Cometa provides, as we're about to hear, software and an operating platform for private sector schools in Mexico. And I think it's quite timely because, as I mentioned at the beginning, much of Mexico City has been sort of held to ransom by the dissident teachers union, the CENTE, who are asking for guaranteed pensions at the same level as their last salary, which the government is not, at the moment at least, conceding on. And as a result, in part of the state of the state education, which is not helped by what's going on, a lot of these states where the CENTE is present, the schools are closed or semi-closed. You're seeing reasonable growth in the private system as people are leaving the public system. And they just put out an interesting report, which I read before the interview, on the estado actual de la educación privada. And 60% of private schools in Mexico charge less than 4,000 pesos a month. So they're really aimed at the middle and lower middle classes. These are not the elite schools like the American school or the Liceo, which are charging 20,000 to 30,000 pesos a month. These are much more accessible schools, and they're trying to kind of bridge the gap that's left by the problems in the state system.
Yeah, it's a topic, again, where Mexico shows that it's failing to provide public education at a good level. And I would suspect that parents notice, and they are sacrificing some of their savings in order to give their kids a better education with someone that can guarantee at least or offer a better product and what they're getting at the state level. But I guess we'll hear more from Cometa in a second about this interesting topic.
So it's a real pleasure to have with us today Andrés Benavides. Andrés is the founder and the CEO of Cometa. Cometa is a leading education technology platform, Edtech, as it's commonly known. Andrés, how are you today?
Good, Damien. Thank you for having me here today.
So Andrés, tell us a little bit the story behind Cometa. What inspired you to launch it? What gap did you see in the market that others weren't doing? Why do you think it's an exciting opportunity?
Of course. So let me go a bit back on my background and sort of my founding story, if you want. I come from a family of educators. My mom used to run a school. My dad started a university. So it's a space I've known quite well for some time now. And I saw that there was an opportunity and there's a need for people to do more things for Latin America in the region, right? And when I went to business school, I went with the hopes of figuring out what we could do to change education at scale in Latin America. And upon exploration and trying to figure out what was needed, it was very evident that our school owners tend to be educators and not administrators. And there's a big opportunity to help them on the administrative front, right? What we saw is that there were many systems that essentially what they did was systematize a bit of the chaos that the school had, but there was an opportunity to go a bit further and automate a lot of redundant processes and generate more order within the school to allow them to have more impact than what they do in the day-to-day, right? So we kicked off with the idea of tackling one of the key processes within the school, which is collections. And from there, we've evolved into taking care of more key processes within the school with the hopes of ultimately building like the infrastructure behind the school, right? Or the operating system behind the school.
Understood. And how's it going?
It's been a crazy ride. We started with 2 schools. It was a bit over 2 years ago, the beginning of the school cycle, 22-23. We're now getting close to 400 schools, and we've been growing significantly, of course, with a lot of good things happening, a lot of chaos, a lot of hard work. But yeah, very exciting. And we're now in the transition of going from the first problem area that we identified into evolving our platform into a multi-product platform, right?
Multi-product, does that include, or will that include credit? Because obviously you have a lot of data to be able to give people credit against school fees or to give schools credit against future payments. Seems like some kind of embedded finance product would make a lot of sense and would presumably be quite profitable if you underwrite efficiently.
Yeah, so one of the things that we noticed is that credit is something very interesting, and we have a unique advantage to be able to give that, right? We have the data behind the school, we have how much revenue they're generating. But when we're prioritizing what to build, we see that there's still a lot of requirements on the software area that has a significant opportunity. And one of the ways that we think about it is it's much more interesting to build software and then add a financing layer on top than to generate like a financing layer and then try to add software on top, right? So our philosophy has always been building products that are key business areas of the school, taking control of essentially what are control points within the operation of the school, and then evolving into building more things out. Within that, of course, is credit, and it's something that we definitely have in the medium roadmap, but today it's not something that we have prioritized.
I mean, for those of us that live in Mexico City, the last week or so has been highly complex because one of the dissident teachers union, has blocked streets, the airport, and everything else. Are you seeing a lot of demand for private education because of the inadequacies in the state-given education?
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting, and every year we do a report about how the education sector is evolving, private education sector specifically, but we do a bit of research about the public sector. One of the interesting things that you see within Mexico is that there's less investment from the public sector proportionally, right? So that, of course, opens up an opportunity because, of course, if there's less investment, the likelihood that the quality is worse is greater, right? And what we've seen in the past 3 years is we're seeing, of course, a growing private demand. Part of that is driven just based on the recovery from the pandemic. But in this report that we're doing this year, the expectations is that the private sector is going to grow 4.2% as a whole. And that just signals that there's quite a demand, to your point, from moving from public education to private education, right? That I think is primarily driven by what you were calling out. And one thing that's interesting is when you look at private education in Mexico, the amount of penetration in like when you look at it proportionally is significantly less than the rest of Latin America. So the average of Latin America is that 20% of the kids go to private school. In Mexico, and for example, in elementary school, that's 9%, right? So it's more than double, right? So there's an opportunity for the private sector to play a larger role in the education sector. And that's what we're starting to see based on the data that we have.
And obviously, there's big differences within the private sector educational system. There's some great schools and some terrible schools, I mean, like anywhere in the world, and some schools in the middle. Are you seeing, based on this report you've just done, which I was reading this morning, actually, congratulations, it's a great report. Are you seeing the private schools getting better? Are you seeing competition driving up standards or not?
A few things there that is interesting to chat about, and it's hard to have, in our assessment, we don't have like a clear proxy for quality because it's hard and it requires doing a lot of tests. But for example, the PISA scores is one that highlights that. But if you want to compare private education to public education, I think one good proxy is thinking how many students per class you have, right? So in the public system, the average number of students in a class is 24 in Mexico. That's one of the highest ratios that you see in Latin America overall, right? And the OECD average is 14, right? So it's like a significant jump from 14 to 24 when you look at the public sector. And then when you look at the private sector, the average is much closer to like 14, right? So at the end of the day, you can see that there's, of course, more personalized education probably signals better education, right? So there's some trends that share that private education should be better from our report. And that's part of what we assume is happening in this transition towards more private education in Mexico, or more kids going to private education. We believe that is because parents at the end of the day, they recognize the difference in quality.
And are you seeing, in what has historically been quite a fragmented sector, are you beginning to see a bit of consolidation, like private equity funds buying up schools, rolling them up, family offices doing something similar? And do you find the consolidated school have better quality on average than the individual schools?
I can speak more to the part about consolidation within the sector. And one of the things that's interesting, as opposed to potentially like a university where it's more consolidated sector when you compare it against schools tend to be family owned or owned by religious congregations, and you don't see nearly as much consolidation. It's a very fragmented market, which is one of the things that we found as a business opportunity very interesting, because there's an opportunity to, it's hard to get distribution, but once you have it, there's a lot of interesting things you can do there. When we look in terms of what's happening in terms of consolidation, there is a lot of that happening in the premium sector. So you are seeing private equity groups starting to acquire the very premium schools, but that is not happening at the same speed when you look at what is the mass market, which is that medium and more affordable opportunities, right? We're starting to see some groups in the affordable sector, but not nearly as much. Potentially one of the only large affordable groups in Spanish-speaking LATAM is a group called Innova Schools, but there's not much more there, right? So the consolidation a lot of people talk about today, which is definitely present, is more in the premium sector, but not as much on the affordable sector.
And when you look at your value added, Andres, is it more on operating efficiency when it comes to billing and managing costs? Or is it more on marketing and getting more kids into the schools that hire you? Where do you see the main benefit from hiring the Cometa platform?
Yeah, in the first 2 years, it was definitely more around the collections component, because that's the one thing we did, right? And our value prop was fully around, to your point, operational efficiency, driving down delinquency, improving cash flows for the school, right? In the last year and a half, that has evolved. And the interesting thing is that the sector has also changed from this survival moment post-pandemic, right, where they had suffered significantly from from a cash flow opportunity, and we've evolved into helping them enroll more students, helping them maintain more of the students with our enrollment products, and helping them sell more inclusively with what we call sort of our e-commerce for the school, right? So it's gone, and naturally there was a window of opportunity that took place that was driven essentially by the pandemic, and that made what we kicked off or our wedge a very interesting starting point. But today, in order to differentiate yourself as a product in the schools, you need to go a lot further, right? And I think there've been a lot of things that happen that if you get wrong, it's not about driving and having 100 functionalities, right? It's about driving outcomes for the school, and that's what we've been focused on. And today, that's driving outcomes in the collections component, that is driving outcomes in the admissions component, and hopefully in a few more products that we're planning on launching soon.
So how do you go about improving collections? I mean, let's say I own a school. What do you do to improve the collections? You offer discounts for early payment. I mean, what are some of the tricks that you recommend?
The interesting thing is that a lot of the reason why there's high delinquency is because of a lack of structure from the school. And it's because if you think about it, an average school has 400 students. That's driving collections of 400 families, right? And managing invoices, and then conciliating the entire, all of the payments. So that is a lot of work to be done. And it tends to be done in a very manual process, which at the end of the day does not allow you to see who's paid, who hasn't paid. Sometimes you're not reminding the parents, which even though they should know that they should pay the school tuitions every month, the fact of reminding them in a systematic order can increase significantly the amount of parents paying on time. So one of the things that we did right was there's a lot of apps that ask parents to download an app, and then they have to get the messaging, whatever. What we did is we went where the parents were, right? So in Latin America, as you know, or in Mexico specifically, everybody uses WhatsApp, right? So we built a payments reminding engine through WhatsApp that allowed us to be able to remind the parents that had not paid or that had an invoice that was about to go late, to have a reminder through WhatsApp, and that increased significantly the amount of parents paying on time, right? At the end of the day, we're not trying to build a third-party agent that's charging for them. We want to build technology that empowers the school to be able to run their processes, right? One of the interesting things is that if a parent is getting really late, say three months or later, it's important for the school to be the ones that manage that relationship, right? You don't want a third party collecting for the school, because at the end of the day, it can break key relationships that they have with the families, right? So what we're trying to do is bring technology that allows them to do it in less work and more effectively.
So you, I imagine, have studied similar types of services offered or similar types of platforms offered around the world. What stands out in Mexico? What makes Mexico's private educational system a bit unique compared to the US or maybe compared to Brazil? Is there anything that surprised you when you look at the data 400 schools later? You say, I wouldn't have thought that based on the due diligence that I've done? That's
a great question. Maybe one of the things that surprised me is how fragmented the market is, right? My expectation would have been that you see a bit more consolidation. And when I jumped into the sector, a lot of what I was hearing was like there's going to be a lot of private equity involvement and whatnot. But I've been surprised at how many of the schools are family owned, how many of the schools are religious congregations that go way back, right, 100 years. I'm sure that's something probably predominant in the rest of LATAM. But when we think about it as potentially external people not as involved in the sector, we think about the most iconic schools in each city, right? And those iconic schools in each city that we've probably heard about more often do not represent what the majority of the schools in Latin America look like, right? The majority of the schools are a family-owned business, or again, like a religious congregation school, and that have the same or similar issues as many of the SMEs in the country, right? So that is one of the things when walking into the sector, I was not expecting to recognize, but it's also one of the things that motivates us a lot because there's an opportunity to give them technology that potentially groups or schools at scale have to these SMEs and make them significantly more competitive.
Terrific. Andres, thank you very much for that. Super interesting what you're doing. Wish you all the success.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure to have with us today Miriam Acuña, who's the chief economist at GBM, one of Mexico's top brokerage firms, with an undergraduate degree in economics from the ITAM, a graduate degree from ITAM in business. She's been GBM's head economist for about 8 years. She's been named for multiple years by Forbes and others as one of Mexico's most influential economists. She's on various podcasts talking about Mexico's economy. She has a great daily commentary on the markets, which I recommend to everyone. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to have with us today Miriam. Miriam, thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Damian, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and join the conversation.
Brilliant. Let's start off with your outlook for the Mexican economy this year and the impact of the ongoing U.S. slowdown on Mexico. Do you think Mexico is going into a recession? Do you think Mexico is more or less dependent on the U.S. than in the past?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question because we currently have a formal estimation for the GDP economic growth this year for 0.5%, which is a little bit higher than consensus. We do believe that the tariffs could have an impact on the Mexican economy, but we believe that it will depend roughly on the MXN depreciation or appreciation. No, we ran an analysis regarding the relationship between Mexico's GDP and the US, and we believe that the economic ties between Mexico and the US have grown significantly. And it's not by accident, no? Over the last few years, starting with Trump's first presidency and the onset of the US-China trade war, follow also by the supply chains disruptions during COVID, the US, Mexico, and Canada have made a clear push to strengthen regional integration in North America. No? So the goal was to bring production closer to home and reduce reliance on overseas suppliers, especially in strategic sectors like autos and, also semiconductors. So what we are seeing today is the result of that shift. I mean, Mexico is more tightly connected to the US economy than it has been in decades. And yes, we are facing some tensions again, particularly with the new tariffs from the US, of course, that clearly go against this spirit, this regional spirit. But even with those frictions, the region has become deeply interdependent. No, so from a macro standpoint, that shows up clearly in the data. Around 70% of Mexico's GDP is now linked to trade and financial flows with the US. And our model suggests that if the US slows down by 1 percentage point, then Mexico's GDP could fall by about 0.9 points. So that's nearly a one-to-one relationship. So yes, we do believe that this exposure is high and growing, but that's because North America as a region made a deliberate bet on deeper integration. And while that brings more vulnerability to US cycles, it also brings long-term strategic advantages, of course, if we manage the relationship well. So we are still expecting this 0.5% of GDP this year because we believe that the risks are balanced. I mean, if the US economy slows down higher than expected, then of course the Mexican economy will grow at a lower rate. But if this size serves at a new, for Mexico, for new investments and, this nearshoring trend and why not, then we believe that we still have some upside risk for the Mexican economy.
And what sectors do you think are most vulnerable to the US downturn? I guess cars because of the tariffs, but also what about services? Mexico has become much more integrated with the US on at the service level, not just manufacturing.
Yes, actually, our paper that we just published, we realized that there are two sectors that stand out the most in the relationship between Mexico and the US. Manufacturing, of course, as you mentioned, but also services, and for different reasons. I mean, manufacturing is probably the more obvious one. I mean, the northern states, places like Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, and Monterrey are deeply tied into U.S. supply chains. A lot of what's produced there depends directly on U.S. demand, especially, as you mentioned, in autos, electronics, and machinery. So when U.S. industrial activity slows, it hits Mexico's manufacturing sector pretty quickly. But what's really interesting is how much services have also become exposed. We tend to think trade, usually, as goods crossing the border, but services like tourism, logistic, entertainment, and even professional services have become a key part of the connection as well. So if U.S. consumers cut back on travel or spending, that impacts Mexico too, especially cities and regions that rely heavily on cross-border activity or U.S. tourism. So it's not just factories anymore. A U.S. slowdown will ripple through both sectors, and that makes Mexico's economy more sensitive in more ways than before. For example, even if manufacturing holds up, a drop in U.S. services activity, say fewer Americans traveling or cutting back on discretionary spending, can still drag on Mexican growth. So we are not just connected through goods anymore. Now we are moving together through services too.
Yet, Miriam, you still have a slightly higher prediction than the medium, according to the Citibanamex or Citi now bi-weekly poll. Do you explain that on your more hopeful outlook on the U.S. economy? Or why do you think you have 0.4 more than the rest?
Yeah, I mean, the economy began 2025 slightly above expectations, as you know, and we believe that this could set the stage for a stronger second half. As I mentioned, we maintain our 2025 GDP growth forecast at 0.5%. I think that the last Citibanamex poll that you mentioned is about 0.1.
That's correct.
Yeah. So, but it doesn't. I mean, we still recognize that trade uncertainty remains the main near-term challenge. It is true that evolving measures and regulatory shifts are weighing on production and investment decisions. Manufacturing is likely to stay under pressure, and private construction may also remain subdued. But we do believe, for example, that government efforts, particularly through the Plan of Mexico, could provide some support. But also we are quite higher than consensus because we believe that services sector should remain relatively resilient, mainly boosted by a strong wage growth and remittances in local currency, even as job creation slows. We also believe that additional rate cuts and any easing in the U.S.-Mexico trade tensions could also help. So yeah, these are the factors that we are including in our projections, and that's why we are, I think, a little bit more optimistic than consensus. But I mean, in the overall picture, 0.5, it's not a great growth. I mean, between 0.1 and 0.5, I mean, the difference is you are slowing down. Anyways.
Yeah, that was my next question, in the sense that I get the feeling that in Mexico we're very satisfied with the 0.1, 0.5 growth rate, and it's ridiculously slow. I mean, I see the government trying to defend that they're growing at 0.2 in the first quarter, when it's really a very pathetic growth rate, and the growth of jobs, it's come to a standstill almost. So you agree with me that we shouldn't be very happy about these numbers?
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. I mean, we are in the middle of different variables that are affecting the Mexican economy. As you know, construction and the industry in general started to slow down at the end of last year. But then we have Trump. No, and Trump, it's a big variable because of the uncertainty that the trade policies are generating. So even if we were a little bit optimistic on nearshoring, it is obvious by now that we are in a pause on that process. No, so uncertainty is weighing for sure on the Mexican economy. But still, we are seeing some variables, as I mentioned, in the services sector that could generate positive growth in the Mexican economy. But I agree completely with you. I mean, the fact that we are now talking about a recession or a growth of about 0.2 or 0.5%, it's not good in general for the Mexican economy. No?
What about the impact of remittances? You mentioned a little bit about them a few minutes ago, but with the tax that has yet to be approved by the Senate, is that a big issue?
Yeah, I think that the proposed tax is definitely something that raises alarms. As you know, remittances are a lifeline for millions of families in Mexico, no? But when you break down the numbers, the macroeconomic impact looks relatively contained. No, and I explained that. Well, as part of the broader fiscal proposal in the US, I think that it's good to give some context. The original idea was to impose a 5% tax on remittances, no? But it was later reduced to 3.5%, as you know, with important exemptions, no? Especially for US citizens who represent roughly 35% of Mexican migrants. So this is very important, no? Because this significantly limit the scope of the tax. So in 2024, Mexico received about $65 billion in remittances, which is equivalent to 3.4% of GDP. No? So our estimates suggest that given the exemptions and the fact that remittance flows are highly inelastic, the tax will only impact a fraction of the total. So we are talking about 0.07% hit to GDP and a similar increase in the current account deficit, no? From the current 0.3% deficit in the current account. So in macro terms, this is more of a political signal rather than an economic game changer in our view, no? Now, that doesn't mean remittances couldn't slow down next year, no? But if that happens, it's more likely due to a U.S. economic slowdown or rising unemployment, particularly in sectors where many Mexican migrants work, no? It wouldn't necessarily be a direct result of the tax. Another key point is that behavioral resilience that we have seen from migrants. No, historically they have done whatever it takes to preserve the purchasing power of their families. So, for example, if the peso appreciates, they send more dollars. If inflation picks up, they increase the amount to make up for the higher cost. So that flexibility could help to sustain household consumption, no? Especially in states like Chiapas, Michoacán, and Guerrero. No? But that said, there are behavioral effects also that are harder to quantify. You know, for instance, the average remittance is about $380. And with this tax, the cost of sending money could rise from around $10 to $24 per transaction. No? So that's more than double. That increase could discourage the use of formal channels, pushing some migrants to switch to informal methods. And also they could switch to bank transfers or rely on relatives with U.S. citizenship to avoid the tax. No? So we might see a recomposition in the balance of payments, with traditional remittances slightly down, but bank transfers or other financial flows picking up. No? Still, I believe that we shouldn't underestimate the regional and social impact, of course. No, in some southern states, as you know, remittances make up more than 10% of local GDP. So even a small disruption could be felt on the ground. There are also diplomatic costs. No, we have already seen Mexican officials, including Sheinbaum and lawmakers, speaking out against the measure. Actually, they visited Washington and even called for a mobilization. No, so yeah, I will conclude saying that the bottom line is that the macro impact is limited, but the social, political, and diplomatic dimensions are much more sensitive.
I wanted to switch to Chinese imports into Mexico that are being re-exported to the United States with no value added in some cases or low value added. The Trump administration is obviously cracking down on that. One, with the 25% import tax on goods that are not USMCA compliant. And secondly, trying to crack down on fraud where products are mislabeled. Are you concerned that crackdown could also negatively impact Mexico growth? Because Chinese firms have been a big source of employment and investment in Mexico.
Yeah, I think that it could be a meaningful shift, but a very target one. What we are seeing is a stricter enforcement of USMCA rules, especially when it comes to re-exporting Asian goods through Mexico with minimal transformation. So that model, which was somewhat common in certain electronics and machinery segments, now faces a 25% tariff if it doesn't meet original requirements. For the companies involved, that's a major change for sure. It forces them to rethink supply chains and, in many cases, move away from basic assembly toward deeper local integration. But at a macro level, the overall impact is limited because around 78% of Mexico's exports to the US could qualify for free trade. And autos, as you know, have a specific mechanisms that is the rules depending on content of origin. Where things get more complicated is looking ahead to the USMCA review. Would officially, Marcelo Ebrard mentioned that it could possibly start in the second half of this year and wrap up around mid-2026. So one of the issues the U.S. is likely to put on the table is Chinese transshipment or triangulation through Mexico and Canada. So we could see Washington asking for mirror tariffs or tighter origin tracking to align with their own trade restrictions on China. So that will be a tricky situation for Mexico because 58% of what we import from China are intermediate goods. Especially in things that we use to manufacture exports, So applying mirror tariffs could hurt our competitiveness in key industries. So I think that Mexico will have to be very strategic during that review process, defending integration without undermining our position in global value chains.
In that sense, Miriam, will the Plan Mexico work in its intention of generating greater contact locally to avoid that 58% that you mentioned in intermediate goods from China? Are you hopeful about that, or how long will it take that to be frictures?
I think that the Plan Mexico has a very good intentions, and it aligns with the U.S. view, And I think that it's a good step before the USMCA review in order for Mexico to mark a standpoint saying to the US, you know what, I am aligned with you in this China thing, But of course, it will take time. As I mentioned, a lot of the imports that we made from China are from intermediate goods. So we will have to adapt our supply chain in order to substitute that imports, So yeah, I think that it will take time, but it's a good first step, I think.
And let me move a little bit on from goods, services, tariffs, growth to inflation. Mexico inflation picked up a little bit in the first half of this month, above even the upper range of the central bank's 4% target. Are you worried? Are we importing inflation from the U.S. as the U.S. is also, with the tariffs, raising its prices? What's your overall outlook on that front?
Yeah, I believe that we are importing some inflation from the U.S., or if not, we are importing already. I think that it's a high risk for Mexico's CPI. No, inflation in Mexico has always been influenced by global trends. No, but over the last few years, the link with U.S. inflation has gotten much tighter, especially in core components like food and services. No, so we have seen it in the numbers that we run. We also ran an exercise here, concluding that 100 basis point increase in U.S. headline inflation tends to push Mexican inflation up by around 45 basis points. And when we break it down by categories, the connection is even stronger. No, correlation in areas like processed foods and services are now around 0.9. So it's quite high. No, but why is this happening? It's not just about goods moving across the border anymore. But supply chains now are deeply connected, as you know. No? Labor and logistics costs between both countries tend to move together, and services, like we mentioned before, things like tourism, logistics, even some business operations are more integrated than ever. So that means that when prices go up in the US, it doesn't take long for that pressure to show up in Mexico too. No? And this matters even more in today's context, no? While U.S. inflation has been relatively contained, hovering around 2.3%, I believe in the last figure, inflation expectations have risen, no? And that increases the risk of spillovers. In Mexico, as you mentioned, inflation recently ticked above Banxico's upper limit, partly due to seasonal and extraordinary factors, like the outbreak of this screwworm that push up livestock prices. But beyond that, we also saw an uptick in core goods inflation. And that's a component that tends to be very sensitive to imported inflation from the US. No? So yes, the connection is real and it's growing. We are not just importing inflation through goods anymore, but through the border structure of our economic relationship with the US. And that's something that Banxico is watching very closely. We believe that.
Interesting. Now, in sense of interest rates, Mexico has been lowering its interest rates. The central bank, Banco de Mexico, has been lowering interest rates quite a while now, while the Fed is on pause at the present moment. Is that going to continue? What's your outlook on that front?
Yeah, following recent guidance from Banxico, from the last meeting, where, as you know, Banxico decided to cut the interest rate by 50 basis points, and they continue to have a dovish tone, mentioning that the rate cuts could continue to be in the same magnitude. So we now expect that Banxico will cut rates by another 50 basis points on June 26, followed by 225 basis points moves, bringing the policy rate to 7.5% by year-end. However, we do believe that the central bank will stay data dependent, closely tracking inflation dynamics and growth. Yeah, actually today we will have the release of the quarterly inflation report, which will be very important to follow closely every sign that the central bank sends.
I guess a lot is still in the air, even though that they predicted that if things go a little bit more haywire, they might hold on those cuts later on this year. On another topic, you mentioned nearshoring as one potential beneficial element of Mexico, because we do have, at least it seems, certain advantages versus other countries in the trade war that Trump has started. Mm-hmm. How confident are you on that end? Or are you seeing any signs that it might be picking up again? I went to a conference last week where the promoter of investment did say that his phone was ringing again for industrial parks and things like that. What are you picking up?
Yeah, I mean, this is very important because I also believe that the sentiment for Mexico is changing for a more positive tone. I will say conservative, but positive. No? I mean, we are at a stage where even though there is a bit of more clarity, the outlook is still far from settled, no? Especially when it comes to Donald Trump's evolving trade agenda. But what it is true is that we are now in a better position compared with our main competitors, no? Regarding the trade war. I mean, we currently have an effective tax rate of about between 5 and 8%, depending on the estimates, compared with the 10% that, as you know, most of the countries in the world have, and also compared with the 30% of China. So it seems that even if we are in a worse position compared when we were before Trump, you know, comparative with other countries, we are in a better position. So that could help in the long term for the nearshoring speech, no? And also, it is worth to mention that even if the nearshoring translates into a reshoring, higher activity in the US also favors Mexican activity. You know, so yeah, I also believe that the Mexican sentiment is changing, and it's because this comparative position with other countries we have already. No, but again, I think that the negotiations between the U.S. and other countries continues. I mean, then the situation is still in an uncertainty way, no?
I guess that will be the name of this year, the uncertain year, probably.
Exactly. Well, hopefully only this year.
Hopefully it would only last 12 months, but I don't think
yeah, exactly.
Trump is a very unpredictable fellow, to say the least. Well, Miriam, thank you very much for your time. I could continue talking with you for hours and hours, but we have time limits. But both Amy and I, thank you very much for your time and sharing with us your outlooks on many of the main macroeconomic topics of Mexico.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
So that's it from me, Eduardo. Thank you, everyone, for joining MexMoves. I hope very much that you subscribe and listen in next week.
Likewise, thanks, Damian. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get a notification when the next podcast comes out. Thanks for listening.